Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is December 22nd, 2022. Helga, as we're approaching Christmas, there have been many people moving towards some kind of agreement on the need for negotiations, but apparently that's not the script that the British are using and are handing to people like Zelensky and Biden. We're in the midst of a mobilization, which includes a call for people to use the Christmas season as an opportunity to participate in a real message of peace. Why don't we begin with that?
Yes, I think that every thinking person is really extremely concerned about the escalation of the war around Ukraine. And that is why, we have launched an initiative to respond positively to the offer of Pope Francis, who has offered the venue of the Vatican as a place to conduct peace negotiations without precondition between Russia and Ukraine. And this was a call which was repeated by the Secretary of State of the Vatican, Cardinal Parolin, who also proposed to conduct a new conference in the spirit of Helsinki. Now, this is very important because, that means obviously he wants to go back to the paradigm which existed before the recent escalation, which is, condemning anybody who even wants to talk to Russia as being a demon, because the Helsinki conference was still in a period where there was the idea that there must be detente between East and West, and that a peaceful coexistence is possible. So, we have issued a letter to the Pope, which is signed by people who are also in this initiative, which started with the Latin American legislators and which is growing now to other parts of the world. And, the signers who are in part a former president, its former and present sitting congressmen from Latin America and other people from around the world, supporting the Pope and calling on people to do likewise. Then we have written a leaflet which has the same idea, giving support to the Pope to conduct such a conference and expressing the agreement of the people who are distributing this leaflet. And we ask you, that is our viewers, to download this leaflet and use it to distribute it at masses on Christmas Eve and on Christmas Day, or in Europe, the two Christmas days. So go to the churches, go to all other religious services and distribute this leaflet. On the back side of this leaflet is the notes of the canon Dona Nobis Pacem. And if you go on our website, you find little videos of people who are already doing that around the world, because the idea Dona Nobis Pacem, give us peace, is exactly what should become the cry for peace around the world. And we ask you to sing in many choruses and, family church choruses, other choruses, because we absolutely have to have a mobilization of the population expressing that we do not want this escalation, which absolutely has the danger of getting out of control. And therefore, we should really use the Christmas period to try to get some reason back into the discussion and get as many forces around the world to make clear to the Pope that his intervention is extremely important, because, you need a figure which is above politics, which is above, the daily controversies. And he has actually, made the offer to have such negotiations without preconditions. And I think that that is an absolute precondition for such talks to succeed.
And I think this is being heard by the people who are proposing more war. The Economist has an article attacking the Pope today, saying that his mistrust of America causes him to overlook seeing Putin clearly. And I think this idea of singing is a way of raising your voice in a most beautiful manner in a call for peace. Now, in contrast to that idea of beauty and the choruses outside of churches, we had this Hollywood or circus spectacular in the Congress yesterday in Washington, with Zelensky coming to Washington on a British script. What's your view on that?
Well, it was really a incredible Inszenierung in German, you would say, a Hollywood production, because the two houses of Congress, applauding. You had a whole not so nice chorus of people like from the Atlantic Council who say, Zelensky is the Churchill of our time. He came to the White House to, get rid of the confusion which existed in the White House, meaning that, there apparently were some Europeans saying that not more heavy weapons should be delivered to Ukraine because Europe does not want to be in a war with Russia, which could turn nuclear. So what Zelensky basically said, his usual kind of demand more weapons. I mean, the United States has promised already a certain number of Patriot missiles. He wants more. He wants more of every weapon type. And, these are now becoming really offensive weapons, which can be used for offensive purposes. And, the big, question is, when do we cross the tripwire, which is unacceptable for Russia? Now, various Russian spokesmen have, I think it was Shoigu, the last, who said that Russia is finding itself in a war of the entire West against Russia. Now, this is getting to the point where, sooner or later, this will go in the wrong way and out of control. And that is it for mankind. Because once you get into an open war, and let's be very clear about it, these Patriot missiles, they are already crossing the line. It makes the United States a war party already before. Shoigu said that, de facto the West and the US and Britain being the worst of it, they're giving everything to the Ukrainians, mercenaries, advisors, training of the troops, which is done now in Germany, which makes Germany a war party, and heavy weapons of all kinds of weapon systems. Now, the only thing one can say is, and this we learned from, I think it was Scott Ritter who pointed this out, that these Patriot missiles, while they are potentially a frightening weapon, they are not functioning so well. So when the United States used them in Iraq, for example, they were failing many times. So weapons are being given to the Ukrainians, which according to some other experts takes months to be trained on. But it is very clearly an escalation. So, if you look at the figures, Zelensky got another 1.85 billion this time on his trip. Altogether, the United States has already provided weapons for $100 billion. Now, that is more than the entire military budget of Russia of an entire year, which is 65 billion. So, it's really high time that an end is being put to that, because the victims of this whole thing are the Ukrainian people, who are dying for no good reason. The Russian people, where more and more are also being killed. So I think this has to stop. And I'm really calling on all people who are reasonable, who understand that war is the worst threat to human rights, because it takes life. So no more human rights, because no human life is left. And join us in this peace mobilization, which must become a very strong voice, that negotiations must occur immediately and a solution must be found. The reconstruction of Ukraine must start. Ukraine should become a bridge between East and West. And, this is extremely important. And obviously, the picture at large does require a completely different security architecture for, the world to come out of this geopolitical powder keg.
And part of the absurdity of the congressional response was the expression of Senator Schumer from New York, who said that Zelensky came to us to speak of his fight for our democracy. And he said he's a great Democrat. Meanwhile, Zelensky has suppressed every opposition party, every opposition media in Ukraine. But of course, we know from the Diane Sare campaign, Schumer not only was funding that, but Schumer was involved in suppressing free speech in the United States. Now, as part of this buildup, there were a series of discussions of so-called experts at the Atlantic Council. We've highlighted before the role of Chatham House and the Atlantic Council as providing the talking points from the British. What did you think of these Atlantic Council so-called experts?
Well, they're just warmongers, the son of Brzezinski. I mean, the son, I'm not for holding families responsible, but in this case, the son is unfortunately the apple which doesn't fall far from the tree, like his evil father, who had a very crucial role in the medium-range missile crisis at the beginning of the 80s. I heard from a very well-placed person in Germany that Brzezinski one time came into the office of Helmut Schmidt, and Helmut Schmidt kicked him out and said, you are trying to get us into World War III. And this was in the middle of the medium-range missile crisis, where the Pershing II and the SS-20 were within minutes in a launch on warning position in Europe. So his son, Ian Brzezinski, is demanding now all kinds of weapon sales to weapon deliveries to Ukraine. And then you had some other experts, altogether 7, who were making ridiculous statements about Zelensky being the Churchill of our time. And it's just a Hollywood, scenario where you orchestrate something which you hope is influencing public opinion. But I think the people by now know that this is, not in their advantage. In the United States, there are polls that only less than 1% thinks Russia is an issue at all. Most people are concerned about, the inflation, energy, housing prices, and these kinds of things. And nobody wants World War III, but there are some elites, who try to keep their failing system by risking World War III.
And you mentioned before some comments from Russia. We saw Nebensia at the United Nations talking about the importance of the return of the funds to the Afghan government. But I think in relation to Ukraine, you had the comments about the Russians insisting that an investigation take place, an honest investigation into the Nord Stream pipelines. That's been pretty much forgotten in the West, hasn't it?
Well, I think as the life becomes more miserable for people in Germany and other European countries, the fact that Nord Stream 2 was, the 2 pipelines were sabotaged, it's amazing, that this happened. Everybody knows, and the famous little birds are piping it from the roofs, as you say in Germany. Die Spatzen pfeifen es vom Dach, that the only force which had the control over that part of the Baltic Sea is the United States and, some NATO allies, but did it with the knowledge of the United States, at least. And, the idea that it would have been Russia is absolutely ridiculous. So if the Russian ambassador says that they will not allow that the whole Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream question is put under the carpet, I think this is very valid because, I think for some Europeans, it starts to dawn that this famous alliance is not in their best interest. Not only is their pipeline being blown up, which was the source or could have been the source of cheap energy, which is one factor why, you know, people had a decent living standard. But now, you know, this horrible government which we have in Germany right now with these horrible two green NATO ministers, you know, we are now importing expensive LNG gas from the United States, which naturally is making the exporters in the United States happy, which is why the US is not experiencing the economic crisis quite as badly as Europe at this point. But for Europe, it makes energy prices go through the roof. It means that many firms are going bankrupt. So I think that there are more and more people, at least that's from our experience, who are having second thoughts. You know, what kind of an ally is that, you know, who is ruining you economically, who is now luring European firms to come to the United States because they have better conditions there and energy prices become unpayable in Europe. So this is not exactly the kind of behavior you would want a partner or even a friend to have. So this is eroding the alliance. It may not be visible this minute, but I think it is a process of erosion.
Well, and at the same time, you had this insane discussion of capping the prices. The European Union is going off the deep end on virtually every area of policy.
Yes, they have now this, I have to actually look it up, it's called Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. This is the latest scheme they are pushing. It's the idea that naturally you will have, because of the carbon debate, very high prices for energy intensive productions like steel, aluminium, paper, fertilizer, things like that. But if now a firm which says I cannot produce in the EU under these conditions is thinking about outsourcing his production to countries which have lower prices, then they have, if this scheme ever goes into full effect, they will have to have tariffs by re-importing whatever they produce in another country. So it will make everything much, much more expensive in the EU, but it will absolutely kill economic development in the developing countries. And actually, the countries which will be hit the most will be China, India, Russia, and some other developing countries. So this is a scheme which is designed to absolutely stop economic development and reduce the world population. It's, they always come up with a new scheme. I remember it started early in the 70s with the Club of Rome coming out with the fraudulent thesis of there is a limit to growth, which was a fraud. Then a little bit later, the Trilateral Commission and the Council of Foreign Relations were pushing the project of the 80s, which was the idea of a controlled disintegration of the world economy. They published, I think, altogether something like 25 long studies in the form of books published by McGraw-Hill. And these were all, scripts how to make sure that there is no mercantilism in the developing countries and no socialism and absolutely no mixture of mercantilism, they called it that way, and socialism, and to prevent another Japan from ever emerging in the developing countries. Now, another Japan is the synonym for the idea that Japan, which was, after the basically Japanese kicked out foreigners, I think in the 15th century or so, they were extremely isolated and not developed for several centuries. But then in the middle of the 19th century, when they sent out emissaries to the United States, to Holland, to Germany, and bring back economic theories of how to develop Japan on the basis of Friedrich List, on the basis of Henry C. Carey, they started what was then called the Meiji Restoration. And in a few years, literally in a few years, Japan became one of the leading industrial nations. So the project of the 80s was to absolutely prevent that this would never happen again, never again Japan in the developing countries. And then naturally, the World Wildlife Fund, and they always come up with a new scheme. And right now it's this carbon mechanism, which is supposed to squelch developing nations from developing. I think it will not work, but it will for sure ruin the European economy, because if you put all these tariffs on production, firms will just go bankrupt, and once they're gone, they're gone. So I can only say people should really wake up and rethink, because all these schemes are only there for the present privileged establishment to keep their privileges, keep the poor poor, and make themselves richer.
Well, speaking of EU insanity, we have the likelihood of an accelerated attempt to decouple from the EU economy with China. You had said earlier that you're looking at the likelihood of an escalated anti-China campaign in 2023. As far as Japan's concerned, they've just announced, I think over the next 5 years, a quadrupling of their defense budget to join with the West, the global NATO against China. This is, first of all, this is not going to stop China from developing or pursuing their Belt and Road Initiative, but what do you mean about this anti-China policy?
Well, I mean, if you look at the German government, there is a certain division where the Greens, especially the Baerbock, is preparing a China strategy paper, which basically says we must diversify, and she is running around already in different Asian countries trying to diversify from the influence of China. The FDP, if you read the new book of this Strack-Zimmermann woman, who is quite something in terms of war hawk, they're obsessed by the fact that China is rising, that because of their ideology of this Green Deal of the EU, they're destroying the European economy. And naturally, when they then see that China is rising, they are demonizing China and Russia, and are absolutely obsessed to contain them, to keep them down, to cut them into pieces if possible. And unfortunately, this, in my expectation, will escalate. It's not just that they want to decouple entirely from Russia, which they have pretty much accomplished, but the next target is China. And we should not forget the policies of the NATO meeting this past summer, which took place in Madrid, which explicitly had the idea of a global NATO. And so that should be seen in the context. I think this will be, if it ever comes to the complete realization of that, that would mean the end of German economy as we have known it. And I think the German industry, fortunately, is thinking completely differently, and they are putting a certain amount of pressure on Chancellor Scholz, who has a more pragmatic approach, and I hope he prevails and is strong and smart enough to do that, because Europe without China is going to be lost. We will be marginalized and thrown to the sidelines of history. We will have a terribly collapsing living standard. And I think we should take up the offer of China on the other side. The Belt and Road Initiative is open for us to collaborate. The Chinese government had just had a major economic summit conference on the 15th and 16th of December in Beijing with Xi Jinping. And there, on the foreign trade and foreign economic relations, they decided to have more opening up, to make easier foreign direct investment, to basically streamline the conditions for investment. So I think that would be much more in the interest of European nations. And if the United States wants to really have a peaceful perspective, the offer to cooperate with China, with the BRICS, plus with the countries of the global south, that is the direction to go, because anything else leads to World War III. And therefore, we should really, really get a discussion going of how do we organize the living together of nations in the future. I can only say that the conference we had with the Schiller Institute, where I presented 10 principles of how a new security and development architecture could be organized, is finding more and more resonance. More and more experts are studying the proposal, and hopefully it can become a factor in reorganizing this absolutely out of control situation.
Well, we're just a couple of days from Christmas, and while some people use the holidays as an opportunity to try to escape, it's also the best time to reflect on the potential for peace based on goodwill toward all mankind. This is what is in your 10 principles, and I wonder if you want to just reflect, help people get a sense of the importance then of our mobilization, which is not really just about the Pope, it's about every person on the planet taking responsibility for the future of mankind.
Yes, I think that at a moment when World War III is looming, and I think this is the biggest worry people should have, the fact that the existence of mankind is threatened makes every citizen automatically into a world citizen. And Friedrich Schiller, according to whom the Schiller Institute is named, made emphatically the point that people should be world citizens and patriots, and there must be not a contradiction between the two. So maybe over Christmas you should think about, if you want to look at it religiously, this is the birth of Jesus Christ, and this was an incredible fact, because the fact that God decided to become man and was both man and God, in a certain sense, it has given mankind a dignity which you had in Plato already, because of man being capable of reason and creative hypothesis formulation and so on. So all the ideas philosophically were there in Plato, but Christianity added something to it through the person of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not a theologian, and I only know these things because I studied a lot of, history, like, church history, Nicolaus of Cus and other people in the tradition of Augustinus. But Christmas is really a time to reflect on all of these things. Think about the immortality of the soul. Think about the identity of mankind. Are we here just to consume and live our short life, and then that was it? And on our grave, then you have written, this person owned 2 Mercedes and ate 10 kilos caviar, and that was it? Or should people remember us because we contributed something to the further development of mankind? And Christmas is really a time to clean out your system of bad things and put in some better ideas coming from Christianity, coming from humanism, coming from the best traditions of all cultures, and basically decide to become a better human being.
Well, Helga, thank you for joining us today. And on behalf of all our viewers, I wish you a Merry Christmas. And I know you wish all of our viewers a Merry Christmas. So we'll see you on the other side of Christmas.
Yes, till next week.